Early Sunday morning off the coast of Oman, the crew of a Cyprus-flagged container ship had to abandon their own vessel and climb into a lifeboat, watching their ship burn behind them in the dark. Hours later, on the other side of the world, the President of the United States authorized a response so large that American forces would go on to strike more than 300 separate targets inside Iran within a single week. That is not an exaggeration. That is the confirmed on-the-record number from U.S. Central Command itself. And I want to walk you through exactly how a single attack on a commercial ship turned into one of the largest sustained strike campaigns of this entire war, step by step, with a source behind every claim I make. Let's start with exactly what happened, because I want you to have the real sequence of events before anything else, sourced directly and not filtered through anyone's spin, since a story this consequential deserves nothing less. According to CNN's reporting from July 11th, the crew of a container vessel damaged near the Strait of Hormuz were forced to abandon ship early that Sunday, according to the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre, which posted that the crew were embarked in a lifeboat after a fire broke out aboard the vessel following damage to its rear section, a detail that underscores just how close this specific incident came to costing lives before any American response had even begun. And CENTCOM's own statement, also reported by CNN, said Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps blatantly attacked a Cyprus-flagged container ship transiting the strait, and that one crew member was still missing, a detail that remained unresolved even in the days of reporting that followed this initial incident. According to the Hill's reporting, that ship has since been identified as the container vessel GFS Galaxy, and it sustained what CENTCOM described as significant damage to its engine room, damage severe enough that the vessel was left dead in the water and entirely dependent on rescue rather than able to continue under its own power. Iran's own account, according to that same Hill reporting, was that its Revolutionary Guard fired a warning shot at a vessel attempting to use what it called an unauthorized route through the strait, a justification that itself became a flashpoint once American officials pushed back on it publicly in the days that followed. And here's the moment that actually escalated this from a single incident into a full crisis, one that most people following the war casually likely never connected back to a single container ship at all. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced the closure of the Strait of Hormuz until further notice that same Saturday night, directly following that attack on the container ship. Think about what that actually means for a second, because it's easy to hear the phrase, closed the Strait of Hormuz, and not fully register the scale of it. This is the waterway that a huge share of the entire planet's oil and gas exports pass through every single day. Iran didn't just attack one ship, it used that attack as the pretext to declare the single most important oil choke point on Earth off limits, unilaterally, to the rest of the world, without waiting for any international body or neutral party to weigh in on the decision. And if you want a sense of just how much history this exact waterway carries, this isn't the first time a ship has burned in these waters because of an Iranian attack. Back in the 1980s, during what became known as the Tanker War, a phase of the Iran-Iraq conflict, Iran and Iraq both attacked commercial oil tankers moving through the Persian Gulf, eventually drawing the United States Navy directly into escorting and protecting neutral shipping just to keep the region's oil flowing. That conflict, decades ago, established the same basic pattern we're watching repeat itself right now, a regional power using attacks on civilian commercial shipping as a tool of pressure, and the United States eventually stepping in militarily, specifically to keep that one narrow strip of water open for the rest of the world. The names and the specific weapons have changed since then, drones and cruise missiles instead of mines and gunboats. But the underlying strategic logic sitting at the center of this entire crisis is almost exactly the same as it was 40 years ago. So here's your first marker for this video, and I want you to hold on to it. One ship, one warning shot, and an entire global shipping lane declared closed within hours, before most of the world had even woken up to the news. Now let's talk about why Iran says it did this, because context matters here, and I don't want to present this as a random, isolated act of aggression without the backdrop that led to it, since a story missing that context tells you far less than one that includes it. According to Al Jazeera's coverage, Tehran framed the strait's closure as a direct response to what it called Washington violating a memorandum of understanding that the two countries had signed the previous month. That agreement, according to documented reporting, was a 60-day interim ceasefire arrangement signed on June 18th, an attempt at a diplomatic pause after months of fighting. But according to the Hill's reporting, CENTCOM's own statement made clear that from the American side, the picture looked very different. The military said, in its own words, that Iran was provided yet another opportunity to demonstrate adherence to the Memorandum of Understanding after being held accountable for earlier attacks on commercial vessels, but had again failed to do so. So you have two completely opposite framings of the same set of facts, Iran claiming American violations justified closing the strait, and the United States claiming Iran was the one repeatedly breaking the agreement by attacking commercial shipping. I'm not going to pretend there's a clean, universally agreed answer to which side broke the deal first, because depending on which government's statement you read, you get a different villain in the story, and I think it's worth being upfront about that rather than picking a side for you. What isn't in dispute, though, is what happened next, and that's where the real weight of this story actually sits. Now here's the part of this story that the title of this video is actually about, and here's your second marker, the moment where a defensive posture turned into something far larger. According to reporting from Global Security, org and independently confirmed through CENTCOM's own public release, the United States completed what it called a third round of strikes against Iran that same week on July 11th, hitting approximately 140 Iranian military targets in a single operation. CENTCOM's own statement, and I'm reading this directly from their release, said American forces used precision munitions launched from land and sea-based fighter aircraft, drones, and naval vessels, and that the targets included Iranian missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage facilities, communication networks, and coastal surveillance locations. And this wasn't a one-night event in isolation. That same CENTCOM release confirmed that across 3 separate nights of strikes that week, July 6th through July 11th, American forces struck more than 300 targets total inside Iran. Let me put that number in perspective for you, because 300 targets in a single week is an enormous operational tempo for any modern military campaign, one that dwarfs the pace of most conventional conflicts fought anywhere on Earth in the last several decades. That's not a symbolic retaliatory strike meant to send a message and then pause. That's a sustained, continuous degradation campaign specifically designed to strip away Iran's ability to threaten the Strait at all, target by target, night after night, until there's simply nothing left capable of hitting a commercial ship. Compare that operational tempo to almost any other modern conflict you can think of, and it stands out immediately as an extraordinarily intense, compressed pace of sustained military action. And I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it's one of the more interesting tensions buried inside this entire exchange. Iran closed the Strait specifically to assert control over it, to use it as leverage, but every single one of those 300 targets the United States struck that week was specifically chosen because it represented Iran's capability to actually enforce that closure. Missile sites, drone storage, naval assets, coastal radar. So in trying to seize control of the Strait through force, Iran effectively handed the United States a very clear, very specific target list of exactly what needed to be destroyed to reopen it. I'd be curious whether you think the trade-off was worth it from Tehran's side, because from the outside looking in, it looks like an extremely costly way to make a political point. Now let's zoom out, because I don't think you can fully understand why this particular week escalated the way it did without the broader war sitting behind it. According to Fox News' documented reporting, this entire conflict reignited in a massive way back on February 28th, in an operation the U.S. military itself dubbed Operation Epic Fury. That opening operation struck more than 1,000 sites across Iran within its first 24 hours alone, according to CENTCOM, using B-2 stealth bombers, F-22 and F-16 fighter jets, A-10 attack aircraft, and EA-18G electronic warfare planes in a coordinated assault carried out jointly with Israel. And according to that same reporting, Iran's own supreme leader at the time, Ali Khamenei, was killed in those strikes along with dozens of senior regime officials. Think about the magnitude of losing your own head of state in the opening hours of a war for a second, because that's not a detail that should just slide by unremarked. Losing a supreme leader in the first day of a conflict is the kind of decapitation strike that fundamentally reshapes a country's entire chain of command overnight. And it's part of why the leadership structure inside Iran's government looks noticeably different today than it did before this war began, with a new generation of officials now speaking on Tehran's behalf in exactly the kinds of statements and threats we've been walking throughout this video. That is the scale of what this war has already involved before we even get to the container ship incident in July. So when CENTCOM talks about hitting 140 targets in a single night in July, that's happening against the backdrop of a conflict that had already, months earlier, produced one of the most intense single days of American air power used anywhere in the world in recent memory. So here's your third marker. This isn't a war that suddenly escalated in July out of nowhere. It's a war that had already gone through one of its most explosive chapters back in February, cooled into an uneasy ceasefire by June, and then reignited right back into heavy, sustained combat within weeks of that ceasefire being signed. Let's talk about what happened immediately after that July 11th strike wave, because Iran's response tells you a lot about how this conflict keeps cycling. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, on the Sunday following the strikes, Iran claimed attacks on 5 separate Gulf nations: Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, Qatar, and Oman, describing them as retaliation for the renewed American bombing of cities along Iran's southern coast. That same reporting describes sirens blaring in some of those countries, with governments telling residents to stay indoors, and Oman specifically saying it was taking, in its own words, all necessary measures to deal with the developments to preserve the safety of the country and its residents. So within about 24 hours of the United States striking 140 targets inside Iran, the conflict had already spread outward to touch 5 additional countries across the region, all of whom had nothing directly to do with the original container ship incident that started this specific chain of events. And according to reporting from Iran International, that pattern of tit-for-tat escalation didn't stop there either. Kuwait reported that an Iranian strike hit one of its own naval vessels, injuring 4 service members, while Kuwaiti forces intercepted 1 ballistic missile, 5 cruise missiles, and 33 drones in a single engagement, with falling debris still managing to damage civilian and critical infrastructure despite those interceptions. That same reporting documented CENTCOM completing yet another round of strikes on July 14th, hitting dozens of additional military targets near the Strait of Hormuz and along Iranian coastal areas, in a 7-hour operation using fighter aircraft, drones, and naval vessels once again. And, according to that same Iran International reporting, the IRGC responded to that round of strikes by explicitly threatening the region's entire energy supply, saying that as long as what it called American evil actions continued, not a single drop of oil and gas would leave the region. Think about the audacity of that specific threat for a second, because I think it deserves to be highlighted on its own. This is a regional power threatening to choke off literally all oil and gas exports from an entire region of the world, not just from its own country. As a bargaining chip in a war, it's actively losing target after target in. That's an enormous, almost civilization-scale threat being used as a pressure tactic in a conflict that, by every count we've walked through so far, Iran's own military infrastructure keeps losing ground in. Now, here's something that I think most casual coverage of this war misses entirely, and it's your 4th marker. This wasn't a conflict that paused after that mid-July exchange either. According to reporting from the Gateway Pundit, cross-referenced against CENTCOM's own public statements, the United States conducted its 11th consecutive night of strikes against Iran on July 21st, striking Iranian military operations centers, maritime capabilities, aircraft hangars, drone storage facilities, and military logistics infrastructure. 11 consecutive nights. Not 11 scattered strikes over 11 weeks, 11 straight nights of continuous American air and naval power hitting targets inside Iran, specifically framed, according to that reporting, as an effort to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. And according to the Jerusalem Post's reporting from around that same window, CENTCOM had also reinstated the naval blockade of Iranian ports entirely, alongside these ongoing strikes, meaning Iran wasn't just absorbing repeated bombing runs, it was also watching its own maritime trade get physically cut off at the same time. I want you to sit with that combination for a second, because it's a genuinely brutal 1-2 punch from a purely strategic standpoint. 11 straight nights of strikes, degrading your military capability to threaten shipping, combined with a naval blockade, cutting off your own ability to move goods by sea, all happening simultaneously. That's not a limited, symbolic punishment. That's a comprehensive campaign designed to make it functionally impossible for Iran to either threaten the strait or benefit from it economically at the same time. And here's a number worth knowing that puts the stakes of all of this into real, tangible perspective, one that I think gets skipped past far too quickly in most coverage of this war. According to CENTCOM's own statement reported through the Shafakna News Network, since early May, U.S. forces have helped facilitate the successful transit of more than 800 commercial vessels and 400 million barrels of crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz. 400 million barrels. That's the scale of commerce the United States is claiming credit for protecting through this entire military campaign, which gives you a real sense of exactly what's actually at stake economically every single time Iran attacks another ship or the United States launches another wave of strikes in response. Think about what 400 million barrels actually translates to in the real world for a second. That's not an abstract number sitting in a press release. That's heating oil, gasoline, jet fuel, the raw material behind an enormous share of global manufacturing, all of it depending on ships being able to safely cross this one specific stretch of water without getting hit by a drone or a cruise missile. Every time Iran closes the strait, even temporarily, insurance costs for shipping companies spike. Tanker operators start rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope at enormous added cost and delay, and energy markets around the world start pricing in the risk of a much longer, much more painful disruption. So even the strikes and blockades we've walked through today that never technically shut the strait down completely still ripple outward into ordinary people's fuel prices in countries that have nothing to do with this war at all. Let's talk a little more about the actual mechanics of how these strikes have been getting carried out, because I think it's worth understanding the pattern rather than just treating every headline as an isolated bombing run. Based on CENTCOM's own consistent language across multiple of these strike waves, from the July 11th strikes through the July 14th and July 21st waves, the recurring formula has been land and sea-based fighter aircraft working together with drones and naval vessels, launching precision munitions against a consistent set of target categories, missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage, communication networks, coastal surveillance, aircraft hangars, and logistics infrastructure. That consistency tells you something important. This isn't a scattershot campaign reacting to each individual provocation with a different, improvised response every time. It's a deliberate, repeatable operational template. The same categories of targets, hit again and again, night after night, specifically because those are the exact capabilities Iran needs intact in order to keep threatening the Strait in the first place. I want to pause again here, because I think there's a genuinely important question sitting inside all of this repetition. If the United States keeps hitting the same categories of targets, missile sites, drone storage, naval assets, week after week, month after month, that raises an obvious question about how quickly Iran is actually able to rebuild or relocate that capability in between strikes. Because if Iran is fully replacing what gets destroyed each time, this becomes a genuinely endless cycle. But if that capability is being ground down faster than it can be replaced, then every one of these strike waves is measurably shrinking Iran's actual ability to keep this fight going, even if the headlines each week look similar on the surface. I don't think we have a clean, publicly confirmed answer to exactly which of those two scenarios is closer to the truth, and I'd be very cautious of anyone claiming certainty either way without hard evidence to back it up. It's a genuinely important open question because the answer determines whether this entire cycle has a natural endpoint at all. If Iran's missile and drone infrastructure regenerates roughly as fast as it gets destroyed, then in principle, this exact pattern, a provocation, a strike wave, a retaliation, another strike wave, could continue almost indefinitely, limit only by political will on either side, rather than by actual military capacity. But if each wave is genuinely eating into a finite, shrinking stockpile of replacement parts, trained personnel, and manufacturing capacity that Iran cannot easily rebuild under wartime sanctions and constant bombardment, then the current trajectory points toward an eventual hard ceiling on how long Tehran can keep contesting control of the Strait at all, regardless of how defiant its public statements continue to sound in the meantime. Let's also talk briefly about Iran's own rhetoric throughout all of this, because it's been remarkably consistent in tone even as the military situation on the ground keeps shifting. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, Iran's chief negotiator, Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf, warned that Tehran would not accept what he characterized as one-sided agreements, a direct response to the pressure being applied through these repeated strike waves. And according to Iran International's reporting, the IRGC's public statements throughout this period consistently framed the strikes as evidence of, in their words, evil actions and outside interference, while simultaneously promising that further attacks would continue until what they called the end of U.S. interference in the region. So even as the military balance kept tilting further and further against Iran with every additional wave of strikes, the public rhetoric coming out of Tehran barely shifted in tone at all, defiant, absolute, promising indefinite continuation of the fight, regardless of the mounting cost. There are a couple of smaller specific incidents from this same window worth knowing too, because they show just how widely this strike campaign was actually ranging night to night. According to the Jerusalem Post's reporting, Iran's semi-official Mehr news agency reported that air defenses around the Bushehr nuclear power plant in southern Iran had been activated during this period, though Iranian officials offered no further official comment on that specific claim at the time. And that same reporting noted that Iranian state media claimed a U.S. projectile had exploded near a water and electricity facility on Kish Island, one of the islands Iran has long treated as a strategic outpost inside the Strait of Hormuz itself. Neither of those specific claims carries the same level of direct confirmation as CENTCOM's own strike statements, so I'd treat them as reported claims from Iranian state media rather than fully independently verified facts, but they do tell you something important about the sheer geographic spread of this campaign, from Bushehr's nuclear infrastructure to Kish Island's civilian utilities, all becoming part of the same broader story within the same handful of days. Now, let's bring this back to the strategic picture, because I think this is where the real analysis lives, beyond just cataloging strike wave after strike wave. What you're actually watching unfold across this entire stretch of the war is a single, narrow strip of water functioning as the central pressure point for an entire global energy market, with two sides locked into a cycle, where every attempt by Iran to assert control over that waterway triggers a proportionally larger American response, specifically targeting the infrastructure that made that attempt possible in the first place. Iran attacks a ship, Iran loses 140 targets. Iran retaliates against 5 Gulf nations. The campaign continues for 11 consecutive nights, and a blockade gets reimposed on top of it. Every single escalation from Tehran's side appears to be met with a response that's larger in scope, not smaller, which raises a genuinely important question about whether this specific strategy, using the strait as leverage, is actually working for Iran at all, or whether it's simply accelerating the exact outcome Tehran claims to be trying to prevent. A strait that stays open, protected by an increasingly dominant and increasingly entrenched American military presence throughout the entire region. Let's take one more pass at the actual sequence, because I think laying it out in a clean, condensed timeline makes the scale of it hit differently than scattering it across a full video does. A container ship gets attacked and its crew abandons ship into a lifeboat. Iran declares the strait closed that same night. The United States responds within hours with a third round of strikes that week. 140 targets in a single operation, more than 300 across the week. Iran retaliates the very next day against 5 separate countries, none of which fired the shot that started this specific chain of events. Kuwait absorbs a direct hit on a naval vessel and intercepts dozens of incoming munitions. The United States hits back again on July 14th. The rhetoric escalates into threats against the region's entire energy supply. And by July 21st, the United States is conducting its 11th consecutive night of strikes, while simultaneously running a full naval blockade. That entire chain, from a lifeboat off the coast of Oman to 11 straight nights of American airstrikes, unfolded in a little over a week and a half, faster than most people tracking this war casually would have guessed possible. I don't think there's a clearer illustration anywhere in this war of just how fast a single incident at sea can cascade into a sustained, multi-front military campaign touching half a dozen countries. So here's what I want to leave you with today. A single attack on a single commercial ship, the GFS Galaxy, in the early hours of a Sunday morning, set off a chain of events that produced more than 300 targets struck inside Iran within a single week. Retaliatory attacks against 5 separate countries, a reimposed naval blockade, and eventually 11 consecutive nights of continuous American strikes stretching well into the following weeks. That is the actual scale of what one warning shot at one container ship set in motion, and I think that scale gets lost far too easily when each individual headline gets covered as its own isolated story instead of being connected to the ones that came right before and right after it. I want to know what you think happens next. Do you think Iran continues trying to use the Strait of Hormuz as leverage even as the military cost of doing so keeps climbing with every single attempt? Or do you think we're approaching a point where that specific strategy simply stops being viable for Tehran altogether? And given how quickly this specific incident spread outward to touch 5 other countries within 24 hours, do you think a strategy built around controlling this one narrow waterway can ever really stay contained, or is regional spillover simply baked into the entire approach from the very beginning? Tell me where you land in the comments, because I think this is one of the most consequential ongoing threads in this entire war, and I'd genuinely rather hear a range of different takes on it than have everyone just agree with mine. Every single fact in this video came from named, checkable sources. The container ship attack and the strait's closure are documented through CNN's July 11th reporting and the Hill's coverage identifying the vessel as the GFS Galaxy. The regional retaliation against 5 Gulf nations comes from Al Jazeera's reporting. The 140 target strike and the 300 target weekly total come directly from CENTCOM's own public release, independently confirmed through Global Security. Org, the Kuwait naval vessel incident, and the July 14th strike wave come from Iran International's reporting. The 11th consecutive night of strikes comes from reporting cross-referenced against CENTCOM's own statements. The naval blockade reinstatement comes from the Jerusalem Post. The commercial shipping and crude oil figures come directly from CENTCOM's own statement, as reported through Shafakna. And the February 28th origin of this current phase of the war, Operation Epic Fury, comes from Fox News documented reporting. I'm naming every one of these sources deliberately because I never want you to have to just take my word for any of it. Go check them yourself and come back and tell me if you read this differently than I do. And I want to be honest about the limits of what even these sources can tell us, the same way I try to be in every video I make. We don't have independent, non-governmental verification of the exact number of targets struck or their precise locations, since that information comes directly from CENTCOM's own public statements rather than independent battle damage assessments. We don't have a neutral referee confirming which side actually broke the June Memorandum of Understanding first, since both Washington and Tehran have offered directly contradictory accounts of that specific question. We don't have independent confirmation of the Bushehr and Kish Island claims beyond Iranian state media's own reporting, so those 2 specific details should be weighed with more caution than the CENTCOM confirmed strikes. And we don't yet know whether Iran's capability to threaten the strait is being permanently degraded by this repeated cycle of strikes, or whether it's simply being temporarily disrupted and rebuilt behind the scenes between each wave. Treat everything I've laid out today as the most reliable current picture available from named credible sources, not as a fully settled final account. Because a war measured in 300 targets a week is still, by definition, a war that's very much still being written in real time. One more thing before you go, because I think it's worth saying plainly. It would be easy to tell this story as a simple, clean, one-sided narrative. Brave American forces striking back hard against a reckless aggressor, and there's real truth sitting inside that framing, given everything CENTCOM has documented. But it's also true that ordinary sailors on a commercial ship ended up in a lifeboat watching their vessel burn, that 4 Kuwaiti service members were injured defending against incoming missiles that had nothing to do with their own country's original dispute, and that civilians in 5 separate nations spent a night with sirens blaring and instructions to stay indoors because of a chain of events that started with one warning shot at one ship. None of that complexity cancels out the other, and I don't think a story this serious is well served by flattening it down into pure spectacle in either direction. Thank you so much for watching. If breakdowns like this one, the kind that trace how a single attack on a single ship can cascade into hundreds of strikes and pull 5 additional countries into the crossfire within a day, are useful to you, stay close, because this specific choke point and everything riding on whether it stays open or closed is very likely going to keep driving the next phase of this entire war. Whether that next phase arrives through another strike wave, another round of diplomacy, or something neither side has shown their hand on just yet.